This message was recorded at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove in Asheville, North Carolina. Through the ministry of the Cove, we're training people in God's Word to win others to Christ. It's our goal to develop Christians who experience God through knowing Him better, knowing His Word, building godly relationships, and helping others know Him. We trust that this message will strengthen your walk with God and help you experience Him right where you are.
You know, you folks have moved so fast this week with us, and I again want to compliment you. This is not, if I had to put a level on this, I would say we're probably doing this at having taught BA, MA, PhD all my life. I'd say we've been doing about an MA level all week long, so it's grad level, I would say. And so the more you're hanging in there shows the more you're equipped to be a grad student. Maybe you are. Many of you are. I know I've talked to several of you here. And I appreciate you being here. The questions have been great. It's been a good week. But anyway, my point was we've done so much that we're going new territory every single lecture, but you cover a piece or two of it down here and then it comes up again. So some of this will sound like repeat to you, but we're doing you'll see. It's a totally new subject. And all right, let's dig right in here. What do I have? Till 12:15, right? Okay. Don't want to keep you from your lunch. Okay. First reason to accept the empty tomb. Now remember, this goes back to Monday where we did the criteria. And I'm going to be using some of these criteria rules: multiple attestation, embarrassment, enemy attestation, and so on. The empty tomb is reported unanimously. I could have made this two reasons, but it's reported unanimously in all four Gospels. Now, as you know, an all four Gospel count would normally be a 2 count, right? It'd normally be counted Mark and John. But it's not quite so on the empty tomb, which I'll explain in a moment. And it's also embarrassing because it's female testimony. So I need to explain both points. Critics think that if Mark is in the equation, to repeat what I said before, Mark and Matthew is Mark. Mark and Luke is Mark. Matthew, Mark, and Luke is Mark. Matthew and Luke without Mark is Q. So you get these down for sources. But on this one, critics think Matthew and Luke did not follow Mark completely. They followed their other sources. So the empty tomb sources are not your normal, if Mark is in it, it must be Mark. So there's a difference of agreement, but scholars usually say that between the four Gospels, you have either a 3 or a 4 count. You have either a 3 or a 4 count on the gospel. So right away, instead of multiple attestation, meaning 2, Mark and John, it's 3 and maybe 4. And you might say, well, which 3 and which 4? It's really hard to say. What they're saying is pieces of Matthew do not seem to come from Mark. Pieces of Luke do not seem to come from Mark. And pieces of Luke and Matthew are not the same. So it seems like there's a mixture of several sources, which you can be, some people, whenever they hear sources, if you have a real strict study of the New Testament, sometimes they think you're talking of sources makes you liberal or something like that. You say there's sources in the Gospels. Just remember, Luke 1 starts out saying, inasmuch as I've been aware of all these things from the beginning, he says, I've checked multiple sources, and he says, I've interviewed eyewitnesses. That's the first 4 verses of Luke. So Luke tells us that there are sources here. And when we say Paul was a scholar, being basically Old Testament PhD, I use that phrase. Remember, Luke was a scholar too, being a medical doctor. And one thing Luke brings to the table is he's Greek. So he brings Greek scholarship to the table. And I'll give you one example. In Acts chapter 1, verse 3, where we have that really cool phrase, the King James translates it, Jesus showed himself by many infallible proofs. That's the way the King James unpacks it, but it's one Greek word. The Greek word is tekmerion, and it's the highest level of proof you can get. And Aristotle, now see, Luke would know this. Well, Aristotle wasn't super well read in those days. He's a huge name now, but he was not huge in those days. Plato was the big guy. And Plato gives us Socrates. So that's the big, they study under each other, right? Plato study under Socrates, Aristotle study under Plato. Do you folks know that some people say that the most unique example in history of two geniuses working together in different fields, I'm sure somebody here will know this answer. For whom was Aristotle a tutor? Alexander the Great. Have you folks ever heard that before? That's just a little, you can amaze your friends around a dinner meeting. Alexander the Great's tutor was Aristotle. Could you imagine this? Alex, Aristotle's here. Mom will be down in a minute. You get down here now. And that's a discussion. Here comes the young soldier who's going to conquer the world, and his teacher's the great. At that time, Aristotle was extremely influential. But Luke, we don't know what Luke read and didn't read in maybe, Socrates isn't right. You get it in Plato, Aristotle. Luke had some of this knowledge. And in Aristotle, Tecmerion, Acts 1:3, is the highest level of proof. Aristotle gives levels of evidence, and Tecmerion is the best evidence. And in the Greek, it's just Tecmerion, excellent proof. But in the King James, it's many infallible proofs. The Greek doesn't actually say, many or infallible, but they were, struggling to get an English sense of best proof possible. That's just a neat little insight. And so in the four Gospels, we have 3 to 4. We have a 3 to 4 count instead of a 2 count. Does that make sense to everybody? Instead of just Mark and John, we have Mark and John plus. A little bit of Matthew, a little bit of Luke are unique. So you'd be safe to call it a 4 count. So there's 2 criteria here. Again, I could have made this 2 arguments. In fact, I should redo my PowerPoint and make it 2. Because you're up to 3 to 4 sources for the empty tomb. And I'm going to show you another one a little bit later. We actually are going to be, whatever you say on 3 to 4, if you say 3, you're going to have a 4 count. If you say 4, you're going to have a 5 count, because it's in one of the Acts sermon summaries. And we'll have to take a look at that. So the source attestation for the empty tomb is fantastic. Secondly, embarrassing. You folks have probably heard this before. Probably the best known of the embarrassing arguments is that the women were the ones that came to the tomb on Sunday morning. It wasn't just Jews. A well-known female New Testament scholar did an article on why the ladies came to the tomb on Sunday morning. And she said, it's not just that the Jews discounted female testimony. It was pretty much the way it was around the entire Mediterranean world. I mean, that includes Greeks and Romans. So female testimony was looked down on. And in the Jewish writings, it says something like, all women are liars. But I mean, don't let that bother you. It also says all men are liars. In fact, you could say, yeah, that's what we call sin. The other day I talked about the Christians can be jerks objection. Christians can do bad things. So female testimony was not accepted. However, it is not true, as we often say, it is not true to say that women could not testify in a court of law. They could. However, there was an inverse relation between how important the case was and whether or not all your witnesses are females. If they're all females, you have to use females, and they were allowed to testify. But if there were men witnesses, they would take the men testimony. But it's just not true to say they couldn't testify. So you ask this question. If 4 Gospels, these 4 guys did not live next door to each other, right? Matthew couldn't go over to Luke's house and say, hey, how far did you get today? They were in different parts of the Mediterranean. For example, John is reputed to have written his gospel from Ephesus, and Mark from Rome. Now, that's a long way apart, the Middle East, Rome. And they couldn't check each other out. So when they tell the story of the empty tomb, why would they all mention the women? Now, let me complicate it. Why did they mention the women when the men also go to the empty tomb, right? We've already discussed that. In both Luke and John, Luke says some of the men went, and then he later mentions Peter. John says Peter and John. And like I told you before, there could have been 5. And I just choose as an author to telescope on 2 of them. Or in Luke, 1, he only mentions Peter by name, but he says there's others. Just like Mary Magdalene and John, it says Mary Magdalene in verse 1, and verse 2 it says we. Same thing, that's normal writing. It's called telescoping, when you zero in on something when there's other things going on. And we do it right when people are coming up to me and we get involved with more than one person in the conversation. Or they're there, but I only report what the one person says. So, back to the four writers. Why would you say women were the first one to the tomb when you couldn't say first, but Luke and John had knowledge of the men who went? Why couldn't they have started their story like this? So on Easter, on the first day of the week, 3 of the men, whatever the number, went to the tomb. If you want to get the most respect, why don't you use the men? It's not a lie. They just weren't first. But it's not a lie to say the men went there. So why do they all 4 tell that the women went first when that's going to downgrade your argument in public? It's going to downgrade your argument. Why did all 4 do it when they were miles and miles and miles apart? They couldn't look over each other's shoulder. Why do all 4 accounts come out women? There's a really, really easy answer, because that's what happened. The New Testament is serious about facts. And I gave you an example about the women the other day. You know that the women followers of Jesus, if you watch your Chosen, there's the women hanging around the guys, and they all, they're separated in their living quarters and so on, but the women are there. Well, they were there in the Gospels too. But this is kind of strange. Call it prejudice if you want, but in the Gospels, the women who are there are never called disciples. Only the men are called disciples. But the women are plainly disciples. It doesn't say they're not. It just doesn't call them disciples. And 3 of them, if you remember that really cool verse in Luke, 3 of them were very well-to-do and supported Jesus' ministry, paid for his ministry basically out of their own pockets. Now, we're doing this with James, bro, it's me, a little colloquial language. How would you like to be one of the women and you die and you go up to heaven and you're asked that old question, or the books are opened and you're being judged out of your works after salvation, and somebody says to the women, so what did you do with your life? And those 3 women, the men couldn't say it, but the 3 women could say, I just paid for your son's ministry. Whoa. Talk about ministry. They underwrote the ministry of Jesus, but they're not called disciples. You can't explain all these things, but they played a very special role. And as one of you said to me the other day, Jesus was, quote unquote, liberated. Jesus had a very high view of women. Not in all our political stuff today, but I mean, when the old word was, when it was used, the simple word of being liberated, Jesus treated women that way. And a lot of books have been written, a lot of articles have been written by liberals about Jesus having an enlightened view of women. He did not share the prejudice of the surrounding culture. So some really neat things. So what you get here is 3 to 4 testimonies from the Gospels alone. We'll add one from the Acts sermon summaries later. And that doesn't, you go, well, that's Luke, right? He's already got a gospel. No, you got to remember, the sermon summaries are creeds, and creeds are not by the guy who wrote the book. So it's extraneous to Luke. So we're going to end up with either 4 or 5 sources on the empty tomb. And I think we can make a point for adding Paul, although he never says so, but we'll get to that. And it's embarrassing. Why do all 4 men say the women did it? Well, I would like to think their view of women were raised by having been with Jesus. That's one reason. But that still doesn't even do it, because they're making an apologetic argument. So why don't you put your best foot forward and take it's like the minimal facts. The minimal facts aren't all there is, aren't all there are. There are many more facts. And they could have started by saying the men went there. They didn't. I love the fact that they told it like it was, no matter where the chips fell. But that's a double count. Multiple sources, and you don't use women unless you're making a good argument for history that they were really there. And if they're really there, the empty tomb follows, right? On both those, multiple evidences on a female testimony, the empty tomb follows. So it's really a twofer there. I think this is probably just as strong. I think these two are the 1-2. I think 3 is going to be big too, but I think these two are the strongest arguments for the empty tomb. The female testimony, and number 2, remember we said one of the 12 facts last hour? The empty tomb was reported first in Jerusalem. Now, do you catch the significance of that? Jerusalem is the last place you would give this story if it weren't true. Because in Jerusalem, an hour's walk from anywhere, an hour's walk would get you to the tomb. Probably 15 minutes would get you to the tomb. You don't make a proclamation that the tomb is empty if somebody checks it out and goes, don't look now, but there's a body in there. Now, sometimes critics make a complaint of a very famous atheist philosopher. He's passed away now, but a very famous atheist philosopher takes a shot at Christians here. And his name's Michael Martin. He wrote a book called The Case Against Christianity. He also wrote a book, The Case Against God. He was an atheist. Both published by university presses. And he says, well, let's think about this. You guys say on your calculations that the first sermon wasn't preached until Pentecost, which is 50 days later. In 50 days, you're not going to recognize the body. So even if they walked by the tomb later, they couldn't prove it wasn't Jesus. They couldn't prove the tomb was empty. Oh, well, there's a body in there. It's not Jesus. How can you tell after 50 days in a Middle Eastern climate and they're not embalming bodies? Well, that's a silly critique. And it's a silly critique for a couple of reasons. But the main problem is, well, both Mike Lacone and I, when we did our book together, Case for Christ, we both did this independently. We interviewed pathologists who work in the morgue, and they both said, across the country from each other, they both said 50 days is not too long to identify a body, even in a Mideastern climate when a body's not embalmed. You would know the body. You could tell who it was. Especially in Jesus' case, he's got spikes here, and he's got a big, in the man of the shroud, the spear wound here is about 2 inches across. You'd be able to see those things, and you'd know who it was. So number one, it's not too long to identify a body. That's just not true. Martin was running his mouth and didn't check the medical material. But here's the bigger reason. The New Testament says the tomb was empty. If you went by there and you said, there's a body in there, but I don't know who it is, then the tomb's not empty. I don't care if it's Bill Smith from down the road. The tomb is not empty. So when the Christians say the tomb is empty, it better be empty when somebody checks, not with, there's a couple other bodies in there. We tried not to look. It's got to be empty. So number one, it's not too long to tell, identification. And number two, which I think is even more startling, it's not empty if somebody's in there. But the problem remains. You live in Jerusalem. You could disprove this in a day's walk. And it wasn't disproven. I can't think of a fact about the resurrection that could be more readily disproven if the tomb weren't empty. Now, if they taught this in Rome, then Martin's probably correct. No one's going to get on a boat and go to Israel to check for a body, and then probably by then the body isn't going to be, months later, it's not going to be observable, but it happened in Jerusalem. That's what makes this a very strong argument for the empty tomb. 3, the empty tomb, I just said it. The empty tomb is multiply attested. And it's going to be in 3 or 4 gospel sources, but really you add I'm going to make the Acts comment a separate one because that's a creed, so that stands on its own 2 feet. But really that number is 4 to 5 sources for the empty tomb. I think it's very, very strong. I think it's just a hair behind 1 and 2 if you wanted to give strength of these arguments. Oh, was it up there long enough? Okay. Don't be shy about telling me. I can live with it. I think it's cute. I'll be telling this story. And everybody said, no, not yet. We got to photograph it.
Welcome to the new age.
Pardon?
Welcome to the new age.
There you go. Hey, I'm just happy people want it and want to study it, look it over later and use it. See, because like we said, this is one of the first things out of my mouth on Monday. This is about ministry and about usability. So if I'm contradicting myself if I don't let you use it. Now are we all right? Okay. All right. Number 4, this has become stronger in the last few years. Paul never says the tomb was empty. But it's largely thought that Paul said the tomb was empty. Well, how do you get that? Well, in 1 Corinthians 15, well, it wasn't Paul, it was the creed. But in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4, he says, I delivered unto you that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, and rose again from the dead according to the Scriptures, and appeared. And that first verse says, appeared to Peter and then the 12. Now, watch this illustration here. Jesus is alive and doing well. He dies on the cross. He's buried. He's raised and appears. Okay? Alive, dead and buried, raised and appears. If you think about that process, alive, dead, buried, appeared, here's another way to say it. What went down is what came up, right? The body that was buried was changed. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 15. It was changed. What has to be changed? It was immortal. Now, I mean this sincerely. It sounds like a joke, but I don't mean it that way. If Jesus had a mole on his cheek, he might not have had a mole on his resurrection body. We don't know. We know he had scars, but that doesn't necessarily mean we'll have scars. Not necessarily. Good, there's possible. But I think Jesus' scars were for the sake of identification when he showed himself. But we know not everything is going to be duplicated, because if everything were duplicated, you wouldn't be immortal. And you got to be immortal. So there's changes, there's cell changes, if you want to say it. Maybe the new body doesn't have cells. I don't have any idea. But there's got to be changes, but it's still bodily. What went down is what came up. In fact, let me tell you a little thing about the Greek. The Greek word for resurrection, I have it later, but the Greek word for resurrection is anastasis. And anastasis, the word, when you break it down, anastasis means to stand up again. That's what resurrection means, to stand up again. That's pretty cool. So it involves the body. And if it involves the body, as several major writers, a big book just came out, 700 pages with a German publisher, it's a press that's like the most technical New Testament publications in the world. And this book just came out, and this guy argues for hundreds of pages. It's not Tom Wright, because he does it in the book Resurrection, the Resurrection Son of God, the book I told you about before. But this is a technical by a guy named John Cook. And he tells you the theme. He says, I'm doing 2 themes here for this whole book, 750 pages. It's really an investigation of Isis and Osiris and Dumuzi and Inanna and Venus and Astarte and all these stories about apotheosis and things, Romulus and Remus and things that happened before Jesus' time. But Cook, this is just the other day, this is on that question I had, but Cook makes a distinction between what is similar to and what is causal. And there's nothing in those myth stories that are causal of the resurrection stories, but they're similar. If you heard those stories, you go, oh yeah, I've heard that about, Osiris or about Romulus and so on, because he was another one, Hercules, another one. They're similar just as a category, but not causing of resurrection. But the main theme in the book that Cook is after is that Paul teaches the same view of bodily resurrection that the Gospels do. Now, you remember in the Gospels, Matthew, the women hold him by the feet. Mark doesn't seem to have appearances, but he certainly knew their appearances because he makes those 5 predictions of it. And then go tell the disciples and Peter, which people think is a prediction of the first appearance to Peter. Luke is, they were terrified and affrighted, suppose they'd seen a spirit. And Jesus said, handle me and see, for a spirit is not flesh and bone. You see me have, very bodily. John to Thomas, and Mary holds him by the feet. Holds him somewhere. We assume feet, because the other version, one of Matthew, says the women as a whole did too. So they touched Jesus. He was quite bodily. And the whole theme in Cook's book is, see, a lot of people think Paul had a wispier view of Jesus. Even Christians sometimes think Paul saw a glorified body that was not, let's put it this way. There's some Christians who think that Paul's resurrected Jesus would not have eaten fish and honeycomb. That he was physical when he was on the earth and he was glorified later, and he's still bodily. Still bodily. Don't misunderstand that. A lot of Christians think bodily, but wasn't quite as physical. There was a change because he had been taken to heaven and glorified. I don't think that argument works. But what I'm saying is some Christians think that Paul had less than a gospel view of the resurrection. That whole argument's changed now. Even atheist and agnostic, they don't even believe there's a resurrection. But they think the teaching in the New Testament, including Paul's, is bodily resurrection. So back to the point, 1 Corinthians Creed 3 to 4 definitely lists Paul as somebody who believes in bodily resurrection. And in 1550, by the way, he says flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. He's not answering the question. There's some people think that's a contradiction of the Gospels. Paul's not answering that question. In 1550, all he's saying is, and he backs us up because he repeats it in 1550b. And 1550a, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. What he's saying is you can't go as you are. He's not saying you don't have a body, because the second half of the verse says corruption cannot inherit incorruption. So Paul's not denying that in 1550. He's just saying you can't go as you are, and you will be changed. You may not have that mole on your forehead or whatever. You may not have the scar on your arm. I mean, jury's out on that one because Jesus had scars, but you won't be exactly the same, but you're bodily and you'll be recognizable. Paul says, we will know even as we are also known in 1 Corinthians 13. So it seems like Paul is added. And if Paul is added, now you've got at least 3 from the Gospels, 1 from the Acts Creed and 1 in Paul. Now you're up to 5 and maybe 6. If there were 4 in the Gospels, 1 in the Acts Creed, 1 in Paul, now you're up to 6 sources. 6 sources in the ancient world is very rare. That's a very evidential argument to have that many sources. So strongly implied in Paul, I think 4 is going to snug right up against 3 is a very, this has now become a major argument, number 4. 5, this is that sermon summary. Let me read it to you. Acts 13. Now remember, Acts 1 through 5 and 10 are the Acts sermon summaries, and they're Petrine. They're from Peter. Acts 13 is Pauline. By that I mean Paul's doing the speaking. And here's what you get in 13:29. Paul's preaching. When they had carried out everything that had been written in the scriptures about him, they took him down from the cross and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he appeared to those who came with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, and they are now witnesses of these things. And then he says he was buried, he was raised to life, and let me get the exact verse for you here. Let me get it. If you have the scripture in front of you, do you see the verse? Where does it say they buried him? 29, it starts. They carried out everything written. They laid him in the tomb. God raised him from the dead. Okay, so if you're in the tomb and God raised him, it's a bodily, that's even more explicit than 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. He was dead. They laid him in the tomb. God raised him up, and the word means to stand up again, anastasis. And which one?
You said that's what it means to stand up. God raised him.
Yeah, God raised him from the dead is verse 30. Now remember, this is Williams, that Greek thing. God raised him from the dead. So now the sermon summary. Now, in this case, remember I told you that when you cite creeds, you don't say Peter said or Paul said. They are, like Paul said, I gave you what I was given. It's somebody else. This, though, is Paul. The Acts sermon summaries are by the people who are speaking them. They're thought to be creeds, but it was Paul who said it. So there's Paul. That's the second one for you, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, which is not Paul. He's citing the creed. And then Acts 13, Paul is speaking. So it's another reason for believing an empty tomb. And Bart Ehrman, the well-known atheist New Testament scholar, he says Acts 13 might be the earliest of all the creeds. So it's an argument. And he doesn't believe the empty tomb. Well, he doesn't believe the resurrection either, so. All right. Empty tomb was attested by enemies in Matthew 28. And a lot of critics, probably vast majority of critics, don't believe there are guards in front of the tomb. But we're not asking what they believe here. We're talking about what Matthew reported. And that's enemy attestation. And I added two names. Both Justin Martyr, around 150 AD, and Tertullian, about 200 AD. They're a little bit late for history, but it's still good backup. Matthew 28, Justin Martyr, and Tertullian all say that the Jews spread, this says this in Matthew too, that ever since that time with the guards, the Jews spread the story around the Mediterranean world that the disciples stole his body. It's the absolute dumbest theory of all. It just makes no sense because people aren't willing to die, especially in groups. You could have one person who's mentally ill, but people as a whole, a group of people who are all split up and go to different countries, they don't die for what they know to be a lie. They don't forget later, oh, he didn't rise from the dead. You stole the body. Whoa, darn, you're right. Come on. You don't remember breaking into the tomb knowing you could be arrested by the Romans at any moment and take, capital punishment? It was a capital crime. And we talked about that with the seals in the tomb and so on. And they forgot it. And then they gave their lives and left their families again to go into the mission field and preach. Paul says, remember Paul says at that one point, why don't I have an opportunity to travel with my wife? I mean, apparently he was not married, but the point is, Peter and some of the disciples were traveling with their wives. Maybe their kids are older by that time, but some of the disciples were traveling with their wives in those days, and Paul refers to them. But we have this enemy attestation, and Justin Martyr, actually it's Justin Martyr and Tertullian that say it was spread around the Mediterranean. The theory was that the disciples stole the body. And today, nobody has taken that. So every once in a while, some critic goes, it's not the worst idea in the world, but they don't take the theory. And the last time the theory was adopted formally was by a German rationalist prior to German liberalism, which started in 1799 with the publication of a particular book by Friedrich Schleiermacher. It was popularized by a German scholar named Hermann Samuel Reimarus, and he said the disciples stole the body about 1767. That's about the last time it's been taught. So we're like 250 years away from anybody teaching this theory. It's not the smartest tool in the shop, but the fact that they did it tells you something's going on, and it's enemy attestation. Y'all done with this one? Okay. Tom Wright's argument, I told you the Greek words have been mentioned briefly. Anastasis, which is resurrection, and egero means to raise up. Both prominent in the New Testament, and they're both strongly bodily terms. And there's scholarly agreement on this, that Jesus rose bodily. If what went down is what came up, the tomb was empty. You go, well, yeah, I get this point, but how does that mean the tomb's empty? Because if what went down stood up again, the tomb is empty. You know, I was lecturing one time in Stockholm, and I think it may have been Easter. And I was in Stockholm in a Christian church, and the pastor stood up in front of his people, and I'm not very good in Swedish, if at all, but the pastor said, you know how you greet people? Our pastor always goes, he's risen. And everybody goes, he's risen indeed. He goes, come on, you're all dead. Let's do this again. He's risen, does about 3 times until everybody shouts it, you know, in the church. Well, the pastor said, uppstandelse. And they went, uppstandelse. Uppstandelse. And he does it about 4 times. And I turned to my interpreter and I said, what did you say? He said, resurrection. But the Swedish word, as you could tell, uppstandelse, means to stand up again, just like anastasis does. And if what went down is what came out, you have bodily resurrection, the tomb was empty by definition. Does that make sense? So these are great considerations for the empty tomb. Tom Wright does this in 500 pages. I was lecturing once, and a lot of times when you're in apologetics, a lot of the apologists are together in these big conferences. There'll be 7 or 10 of the best-known people that write all your books, and we've all been buddies for a long time. And I was doing this once, and William Lane Craig was sitting right in front of me. And about Tom's book, Tom Wright, I said, Tom Wright wrote the longest word study, Greek word study in history, because his defense of bodily resurrection from anastasis and egero is 500 pages in that big book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. It's about 750 pages, and about 450, 500 of them are a word study. And when I said the longest word study ever, it just hit Bill Craig kind of funny, and he just burst out laughing in the group. And Bill's not super expressive emotionally, but he just thought it was really funny to hear the longest word study ever, but it's the defense of this empty tomb. And the same thing with the John Cook book I told you about. He and Tom Wright are the longest 2 word studies on these words. And scholars who would never have said this 20 years ago, critics, liberals, they've switched over. And they'll say, it's not my personal view, but it definitely is Paul's. And nobody questions the Gospels. I mean, they're holding him by the feet and he's eating and everything else. But it's Paul that they wonder about. And now because of this argument alone, it's the most common view today that Paul also believed in bodily resurrection, just like the Gospels.
What's the name of John Cook's book?
Oh, great. He's got 2 of them. One is on crucifixion, and it's only 500 pages. And then his other one is called, I'm going to mess it up. I won't get the exact title. You know what? You can Google it, John Cook, and in the title is apotheosis. Remember that word I used for Enoch? That is in the title. Apotheosis. I'll tell you what, I'll give you a second. If you go to Google real fast, maybe you can share the title with all of us. There's 3 words.
How do you spell cook?
Cook, just C-O-O-K. Just like the people working down there for our lunch.
I thought of K-O-C-H. But
No, oh yeah, you're right. There's a series of books by the German author. It's pronounced Cook, and it's K-O-C-H. That's true. Did you get it?
See it as the apotheosis of Captain Cook, but I don't think that's what
No, that's not it. John Cook, the publisher, is a German press, so you see it in German.
empty tomb, resurrection, apotheosis.
There you go. Empty tomb, resurrection, and apotheosis. I think about 750 pages. And he's the guy who says, Mike, I'm going to tell you ahead of time. He says, here's my conclusion. Paul had the same view of the resurrection body that the 4 Gospels have. It's a great addition to the literature. It's one thing to say Paul believes in body. It's another thing to say he believes that as much of body as the Gospel writers do. And now that's on the table, and it's pretty well accepted. And he's not the only one. If you're interested in this topic, Tom Wright does it in his big one, 450 to 500 pages. Tom, a lot of his reviewers argued that he was overdoing it a little bit because there's probably some exceptions. But Tom argued that, Wright argued that in the ancient world, nobody used the word anastasis or the equivalent in their language, but it's a Greek word, and Greek is the universal language. So nobody used the word anastasis unless they meant bodily. Now, if you would object and go, oh, that's not true. The Greeks believed in ghosts and spirits and things like that. And Tom would say, you're just not listening to my argument. Of course they believed in ghosts and spirits, but they didn't use the word anastasis for it. When they used anastasis, he claims there's not a single case in the Mediterranean world for several hundred years. In fact, he claims there's never a case until the Gnostics messed it up in the late 1st century, around 175 AD. In the late 2nd century. Did I say 1st century? Late 2nd century. The word meaning did not change until the Gnostics that mixed Greek philosophy with New Testament, till they made it wispy, see-through. Jesus was really there, but he was insubstantial. Philosophers say he's extended in space and time. He occupies room, but you might put your hand right through him. I mean, he's like a ghost or a spirit. That didn't happen, Tom says, until about 175, way after the New Testament. And so Tom argues that down through history, so these are 2 strong arguments. Tom Wright, everybody in the Greek world, nobody used anastasis and didn't mean body. Yeah, they believed in demons and spirits, but they called them pneuma in the Greek. They didn't call it anastasis. If they used anastasis, you know they mean body. That's Tom. John Cook's argument is when you study the language of John's verses, see, Tom's was everybody's the same. Cook's is sort of like that, but he emphasized some different elements. The 2 books together are 1,500 pages, just on bodily nature. Mike Licona has about 25 pages on it in his resurrection book, and his arguments are different than Wright's and Cook's, and his are very good, Mike. And then another one, there's a couple of Gundry boys, Gundry brothers. One of them's probably the dean of evangelical publishing at Zondervan. He's got a doctorate in New Testament and used to teach, but he's now the director of books at Zondervan. His brother, his name is Stan Gundry. His brother is Bob Gundry, who's retired now, but he was at Westmont College in California. Bob Gundry published a Cambridge University monograph. Now, monographs are usually things people don't read. They're like reading a technical doctoral dissertation. And monographs are usually kind of short, filled with different languages, and making very nuanced arguments. Well, Bob Gundry wrote one called Soma, which is body, S-O-M-A in Greek. Soma, with special emphasis on Pauline anthropology. That's the title of the book. It was published by Cambridge University Press. Soma, with special emphasis on Pauline anthropology. And he's got a chapter in there, it's 12 or 13, and it's called Soma in Death and Resurrection. Soma in Death and Resurrection. Now, when he wrote that book, the leading view was Rudolf Bultmann. I'm surprised it took me that long to mention his name. He was the most influential critic in the 19th century, and he was to the left of a Bart Ehrman or somebody like that. He was very, very skeptical. He'd be like the Jesus Seminar. In fact, the Jesus Seminar said he was one of the main inspirations in our life. And I won't go into detail, but Bultmann took another view. And it wasn't that Paul taught, the Gospels teach bodily resurrection for Bultmann, which he didn't believe, but the Gospels believed it, but Paul doesn't. Paul was not bodily. And Bob Gundry wrote his whole book to oppose Bultmann's view. And in the chapter on Soma in Death and Resurrection, he uses yet another argumentative approach from the Greek to prove that resurrection was bodily in Paul. So you've got Cook and Wright, who are equally long and kind of similar. Mike Licona takes a little different tact, and Bob Gundry, Soma, with special emphasis on Pauline anthropology, is another one. So if you want a collection of bodily resurrection books and you get those 4 on your shelf, you've got a really good set of arguments. It's absolutely solid. Now, we haven't talked about this yet, but a majority of New Testament scholars, it may be just a little over 50-50, but it's a majority of New Testament scholars, believe that Mark, the earliest gospel, Mark had a major source, which is called a passion source. So because it was his source, it's called a pre-Markan passion source. And it's believed that there was a document, probably came from an apostle, that's where this stuff did, it's like the creeds, and that Mark used a passion narrative to formulate his passion narrative. So whereas Matthew and Luke used Mark, Mark used somebody else. And this passion narrative has everything's bodily events there, but it predates Mark. So the passion narrative, for those who believe it, is usually put back about 50 AD, something like that. It's early. Not as early as the creeds, but it's pretty early. And it would also fall into line right here. Now, these first 8, it won't take us, we've got lunch in just a little while, but there's a reason I took so long on these. These 8 are the strong ones. The rest of them, in fact, I've got a little note right here, additional considerations. These aren't actual full-blown arguments. I'll just be mentioning these and kind of going through them. I'm not rushing for the sake of lunch. I knew my PowerPoint. And these are arguments that are less detailed and less time-wise to explain. But those 8 you put them together, I think it's a case of overkill. It's really, really strong to believe bodily appearances, i.e. an empty tomb. Okay, here's some of the rest of them. Joseph, Nicodemus, and some women are obscure names. You go, yeah, what's your point? Well, Richard Bauckham is the New Testament scholar. He was at the end of the Creed's PowerPoint the other day. Richard Bauckham probably wouldn't mind being called an evangelical, but he's probably, after Tom Wright, maybe the leading New Testament scholar today. Certainly one of them. And he makes a big deal on the names. Remember I said Simeon was number 1, Joseph was number 2, Jesus was number 9 as far as popularity of names. And the point here is that Joseph is a common name, but Nicodemus is not. and some of the women who went to the tomb, Joanna and Salome, those are not popular names. And the argument goes, when people made things up, like in the pseudepigraphal books, the false books that tried to push themselves off, and they would say, the Apostle Paul to the Christians at so-and-so, and it wasn't written until 350 AD, you know. When they use names, they use prominent names that are real well known because they want people to recognize their book as being authoritative. They don't use names like Salome and Nicodemus, you know, names like that. By the way, I didn't say this the other day. Women's names. I was telling you that we're referring to a list of top 10 men's names. All you got to know on women is, not all you got to know, but Mary. 1/4 of all the women were named Mary or a derivative like Maria or Miriam. 1/4, Mary, everybody looks up. You know, so Mary was a very common name. But not Salome, not Joanna, not Nicodemus. But they're the prominent names in these burial and empty tomb accounts. Like I said, not a whole argument, just a consideration. Seriously, yell at me if I go too soon and we're doing this. Okay, Semitisms. One of our criteria was that if it's Aramaic, it's really early, like Abba, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus uses the Aramaic is in the Gospels when he heals sometimes, when he does an exorcism sometimes. Okay, close to the Aramaic is a Semitism. Semitisms are Middle Eastern. They're like Arabic, which is thought to be, not Arabic, Aramaic, which is a type of Hebrew, by the way, and that's thought to be Jesus' native language. No one's saying he didn't know Greek, but his native language is Aramaic. And with those languages, Aramaic and Hebrew, what comes from those are called Semitisms. And here's some of them. In the empty tomb accounts, there are Semitisms, like the name Miriam. Even though it's a form of Mary, it is a Semitic form. They bowed their faces to the ground. That's a Semitic phrase. First day of the week, counting days like that is a Semitism. So this is just another pointer that these are historical insights. Sunday, remember I said there are a lot of references in these accounts to either the first day of the week or the third day. Third day means after the crucifixion. First day of the week means Sunday. The fact that if it's in Saturday, you'd go, oh, they're just saying that because of the Sabbath. No, they're saying Sunday. What's Sunday? Nothing. Then why do they keep repeating it? It's the day the Lord was raised. So just a reference to 1 and 3. Third day, first day of the week, points to an empty tomb. This would take a long time to explain. I won't spend time on it, but technical articles have been published in technical journals that there are sources behind both Luke, and they're not the same sources. Both Luke's, Peter plus others went to the tomb, and John and John's, Peter and John went to the tomb. There seem to be sources behind each of Luke and John at those points. This is a new argument that's only come around. It's only been around since about 1990. And in New Testament studies, that's new. A classic scholar, and classics is one of those fields that they allow, there are people who study classical texts. And a fellow named Richard Burridge was doing his classics PhD at, I think, University of London. And he did his dissertation on the fact. Now, before I tell you what he did it on, let me back up. When I was in Bible college, I went to Christian school for 5 semesters, and everything else I did was secular. But in those 5 semesters, our professors would say to us, Don't call the Gospels biographies. They're not. And I think what they meant was, it's not a day-to-day diary type report of what Jesus did. And Papias, about 125 AD, it's still early, Papias tells us that not only did Mark use Peter, but he says Mark is not sequential in time. The events cannot be made in a sequential pattern. So because of those arguments, and besides, it was popular for Christians to say, maybe you've heard this, that Koine Greek is the Holy Spirit language. Have you heard that argument? They didn't know what Koine Greek was for a long time. They knew classical Greek, and it dominated the Mediterranean world. But Koine Greek, a little different variety of Greek for the New Testament, they weren't aware of it. So Christians started calling it the Holy Spirit Greek. Now they know Koine is a whole thing, and Koine Greek's huge, so we didn't know it then. But I think those are the reasons they would say the Gospels were not biographies. So even evangelicals said they're not biographies. The liberals really said they're not biographies because that implies they're historical, and they don't want to say it's historical. Well, now the whole thing changed. Back to Richard Burridge. He did his doctoral dissertation, and he compared Greco-Roman histories, and he said, look, none of you believe that Gospels are biographies. Liberals or conservatives don't believe the Gospels are biographies. Look at the arguments. And he puts the arguments down for what makes a Greco-Roman biography, what makes a Roman, what makes Greek, and he finds the same characteristics in the New Testament. So he published, you always want to be a guy who writes his dissertation and the whole world stops. And that's what happened. When Richard Burridge wrote this, he's still a prominent New Testament scholar, and he believes in the resurrection, by the way. Had a chance to have dinner with him once in one of these meetings. He's a good guy. Richard Bauckham, too, bought the resurrection. You wouldn't notice the difference between, people. They're all British, but you wouldn't notice it. British evangelicals are seldom inerrantists. Seldom inerrantists. But on all the fundamentals, they're pretty straight. Like John Stott. F.F. Bruce, if you guys remember that name, the big guy on reliability, he was not an inerrantist. So it's kind of a surprise. But Burridge popularized this thing, and everybody's not switched over, but they're estimating like 75 to 80% of New Testament scholars now think the Gospels are historical genre. It's a big argument now, because that means the background is historical. All right. These are fast. These are just kind of even more sliver things. And I'll be done. No early sources disputed the empty tomb. No one questioned it, not early. No tomb veneration. With a lot of the heroes, they would eat and celebrate around the person's tomb because the bones were there. But there was nothing like that in Christianity because the bones were not there, which is, empty tomb. There's no supernatural elaboration. The tomb is empty, but shoot, somebody could have stolen the body. I mean, it's possible. A grave robber could have stolen the body. It could have happened. So just to say the tomb is empty kind of implies a miracle, but it doesn't require a miracle. So it's not like they're just being gullible. No influence from the Old Testament. Whenever they could bring things up like, oh yeah, and thus spoke the Old Testament when it said, well, that's not in the Old Testament. So they couldn't claim, see, if they think you borrowed from the Old Testament, they'd say you're prejudiced. But there's no such, did everybody get that who wants it? Okay. Here's the last ones. Matthew, we already talked about the guard, which is enemy attestation, but one more point about Matthew. It's very plausible. There's no miracle there. You just stuck a guard in front of the tomb. What's wrong with that? Makes sense. Makes the Jewish priest look very smart. Why wouldn't you believe in the guard? We talked about the Nazareth decree, but since I wrote this, I told you there's that alternative view, and the Nazareth decree may not, even though it was in Nazareth, that stone that talks about grave robbing, it may not be legit. And lastly, I've already said it, critical scholars have come over to this side. They basically no longer oppose bodily appearances. So that is it. 28 good arguments, I think, and What's that leave? 12 considerations. 8 arguments, 12 considerations, total of 20.